They laughed at her garage, called it a junk shack behind her back. While other mechanics worked under neon signs and corporate banners, she fixed beat-up tractors and rusted lawnmowers in a shed that barely had working lights. But none of them knew what was buried behind her back wall. And when she finally uncovered it, dust-covered, vine-wrapped, and whispering a history too loud to ignore, it wasn't just her life that changed. The whole country turned to look. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next takes this from local legend to national news. The mornings always smelled like rust and coffee. Not the good kind of coffee, either burnt, instant, the kind she made by memory more than taste. Cassidy Monroe had opened the garage at 6:00 a.m. Sharp every day for the last 3 years, even though no one really cared if she didn't. The shop was small, barely the size of a double wide, with a tin roof that rattled in the rain and a back wall patched together with old license plates and plywood. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Most days, she fixed whatever rolled in lawn tractors, busted water pumps, once even a wheelchair with a bad bearing. Her regulars were kind, older folks mostly, the kind who still called her kiddo, even though she was 30. But others liked to joke that she wasn't a real mechanic, that her garage looked like a storage shed on its last leg, that she probably only got customers because she smiled pretty and wore her jumpsuit tight. Cassidy never let it show, but it got to her sometimes, especially when parts suppliers gave her the runaround, or when she'd see other shops in town plastered on billboards like they were dealerships instead of grease pits. One Thursday morning, a man with a heavy drawl and a heavier ego brought in a four-wheeler with a jammed starter. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, arms crossed, smirking like he already knew the answer. She didn't respond. She just popped the seat off, twisted the wrench twice, and handed it back to him humming. He didn't say thank you. He just nodded, paid cash, and drove off without another word. That's how it usually went. But Cassidy didn't open the garage for applause. She did it because this place was the last thing her father touched before cancer took him. He'd built the garage from scrap, retired Air Force engineer with calloused hands and a quiet laugh, and she'd grown up watching him fix things no one else could. Engines, radios, broken hearts, sometimes. She kept the garage alive not because it paid well, but because it kept a part of him alive with it. That afternoon, while looking for a spare alternator in the back storage area, her socket wrench fell behind the old shelf mounted against the far wall. When she reached down to grab it, her fingers brushed something strange, not a wall, but a seam. Cassidy squinted, leaned in closer, and realized the entire shelf was bolted into a square cutout. Not drywall, not brick, sheet metal. She grabbed a flashlight and pulled it close. There, hidden behind years of dust and tool hooks, was a rusted latch and a faint outline of a door. Not a normal door, shorter, reinforced, with locking pins like something off an old submarine hatch. Cassidy stepped back, heart thudding. She hadn't known this wall was anything but patched plywood. But now, something old, something secret, was staring back at her. And it wanted to be found. Cassidy didn't sleep much that night. Her body was tired. Sure, she'd pulled a 16-hour day like usual, but her mind kept drifting back to the latch behind the shelf. She couldn't stop picturing it. That subtle metallic seam, the locking bolts, dulled with time, the way it had sat there unnoticed through years of repairs and oil changes like a secret that didn't mind waiting. By morning, she'd made up her mind. After opening the shop and finishing a radiator flush for a neighbor's Dodge Ram, she pulled the garage door halfway down and flipped the sign to "Back in 15." It was time. Cassidy rolled up her sleeves, grabbed her impact drill, and started unbolting the shelf. It groaned and resisted, like it didn't want to give up what it was hiding, but after 20 minutes and a few splinters, it came free. She set the shelving unit aside and stared at what had been behind it all along. The door wasn't large, barely 4 feet wide, but it was thick, reinforced, and sealed like something meant to last through a war. Faded stenciling barely visible above the latch read, "Authorized access only, 1,000 959. Cassidy's brow furrowed. That was decades before her father had bought the land. She ran her fingers across the metal, brushing off cobwebs, trying to make sense of it. Her dad had never mentioned anything about this. He'd built the garage on an old foundation, sure, but he always told her the place used to be a canning warehouse, or something equally unremarkable. This didn't look like anything agricultural. This looked military. Cassidy grabbed a can of WD-40 and sprayed the hinge points. The smell brought back memories of her dad's voice muttering, "If it sticks, spray it." She smiled, then reached for the latch. It didn't open easily. She had to wedge a crowbar into the edge and apply slow, steady pressure until finally, with a hiss and a low groan, the door gave. It creaked open just wide enough for her to slip through. She ducked inside, flashlight in hand, and was immediately swallowed by the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The air was stale, but not rotten. Cool, still. She swept the beam across the interior and stopped dead in her tracks. The space wasn't big, maybe the size of a one-car garage, but at its center sat the unmistakable shape of a jet nose cone, paint faded, vines creeping up through the cracked concrete beneath it. The fuselage extended into the shadows. Cassidy stepped forward slowly, heart hammering. It wasn't a full aircraft, but it wasn't just a shell either. She circled it carefully. The wings had been removed. The tail was gone. But the cockpit canopy was intact. The engine intake gaped open like the mouth of something sleeping. She reached out and touched the side of the jet. The metal was warm sunlight from the garage. Must have been heating it, but it felt different, heavy, important, like it had been waiting. Cassidy stood in the dark, surrounded by decades of dust and mystery. Her flashlight flickered as it traced the soft arc of the jet's fuselage. It looked like something out of a Cold War documentary military green, beneath chipped paint, streaked with rust and crawling ivy that had found its way in through unseen cracks. The nose cone was intact, its turbine blades frozen in place, caked with spiderwebs. Above it, the canopy was fogged from age, but unbroken. Cassidy's boots echoed faintly as she stepped around the structure. There were markings beneath the grime-faded numbers, serials, symbols she couldn't decipher. One caught her eye, a stenciled emblem, circular, with a star through the center and 3 letters underneath. Not a commercial logo. Military, definitely. Maybe Air Force. Cassidy brushed it with her sleeve, revealing more of the original color beneath the aircraft had once gleamed a pale silver, not the dull green it wore now. She leaned closer to the fuselage and noticed something else. A small rectangular panel, slightly ajar. She wedged her fingers in and pulled it open. Inside was a compartment, empty, except for a small metal tag bolted to the wall with one word etched into it. Orion. She stepped back, heart racing. That wasn't just a name. It was a call sign, maybe. A code name. Cassidy had grown up in the world of mechanics, but her dad had been an engineer before he was anything else. He'd always said there were planes the world didn't talk about, prototypes, experimental models, projects buried by time and paperwork. She used to think those were just stories. But this was different. Cassidy walked back to the cockpit. The steps to it had long rusted off, but she grabbed a ladder from the garage and climbed up. The canopy was jammed, but a few firm taps with a rubber mallet loosened it. It slid open with a grinding shriek, and the smell that hit her was old leather and dried oil. The pilot's seat was still there, harnesses frayed, gauges covered in a fine layer of dust. She reached in, not expecting much, but her hand brushed against something cold. Wedged between the throttle quadrant and the seat was a pair of dog tags, tangled and dulled with age. Cassidy's breath caught. She held them up to the light. The name was still legible. Captain Elias Ward. The second line read, USAF, blood type, O+. She swallowed hard. This plane wasn't just a shell. It had a story, a pilot, maybe a mission. She turned back toward the rear of the garage, suddenly aware of how silent everything felt. The air seemed heavier now. She pocketed the tags carefully and climbed down, scanning the rest of the room for anything else. That's when she saw it, tucked under the edge of the fuselage, barely visible, a canvas-bound journal, curled at the corners and stained with time. She picked it up, fingers trembling. The initials on the front. E.W. Cassidy exhaled. She had no idea what she was holding. But she knew one thing. This was no accident. This plane wasn't forgotten. It had been hidden. Cassidy closed the garage door and locked it behind her, then placed the journal on her workbench like it was something sacred. The cover was weathered canvas, mottled brown, and fraying along the edges. She ran her thumb across the stitched initials again, E.W., and wondered what kind of man Captain Elias Ward had been. Carefully, she opened it. The first few pages were warped with moisture and barely legible, but as she flipped deeper, the handwriting sharpened. Clean, technical, but with a strange poetry between the lines. It wasn't just a flight log, it was a personal account. Notes about engine tests, lift behavior, wing response in crosswinds. But then, scattered between calculations and performance tables, were paragraphs that read like confessionals. Orion is more than a bird, one entry read. She responds like she's alive, like she's waiting to become something more. Cassidy kept turning pages. There were notes about locations, phrases like Test Range Bravo and unauthorized climb to FL 400. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough to know this plane wasn't standard issue. Then came a page with a date. June 14, 1962. Underneath, scribbled in rushed handwriting, were just a few lines. They shut us down, told me to seal the project, no recovery. No transfer, just bury it. I couldn't. I won't. Her eyes lingered on the last sentence, underlined 3 times. If someone finds this, they'll know she was more than metal. Cassidy sat back, stunned. She had grown up around tools and parts, the language of torque and timing, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't about fixing something broken, this was about uncovering something buried on purpose. She looked across the shop at the jet again. Orion. The way it had been hidden, sealed behind a false wall like a tomb. Someone, maybe this Ward, had gone to great lengths to preserve it, not destroy it. Cassidy's fingers tightened around the dog tags. The plane wasn't just a relic. It was a story trapped in metal and silence. She suddenly felt like she was intruding, like she had cracked open something sacred, but more than that, she felt responsible. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the Georgia pines, Cassidy sat on the concrete floor of the hidden bay, leaning against the fuselage. She'd brought her father's old shop radio, turned down low, letting old country tunes fill the silence. She stared at the plane, at the ivy curling around the landing gear, and whispered, "Who were you, Elias?" That night, sleep didn't come easily. Visions of high-altitude flights and classified missions danced behind her eyes. She dreamed of roaring engines and desert test sites, of a man climbing into a cockpit alone and leaving behind something he couldn't let the world erase. When she woke, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about history. It was about honor. And the next step wasn't restoration. It was revelation. Whatever this plane had been meant for, she was going to find out. 3 days passed before she told anyone. Cassidy couldn't explain why. Exactly, maybe part of her didn't want to let the outside world in just yet. The discovery felt too big, too intimate, to throw into conversation like gossip. During the day, she went about her usual work, changing spark plugs, checking brakes, pretending like nothing had changed. But at night, she sat with the journal open on her lap, reading and rereading Captain Ward's entries, trying to piece together a picture of a man who lived and breathed a dream so powerful, he buried it behind steel and silence. It was late Friday afternoon when the bell above her garage door jingled and a figure stepped inside. He was tall, stooped slightly with age, wearing a veteran's cap and a jacket that looked older than Cassidy herself. She barely noticed him at first, wiping her hands on a rag, but then he spoke. Your father used to let me change my oil here when I couldn't make it to Macon, he said gently. Cassidy turned. His voice was familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Name's Roger Callahan. I served with Elias Ward. The rag slipped from her fingers. She stared at him, heart thudding. You knew him? He nodded, eyes scanning the shop like it was some kind of memory. We flew together in '61. Flight tests. Black book stuff. Not exactly in the press. He stepped closer. I was told this place got sold, gutted, maybe paved over. But I kept hearing whispers. And then someone said the Monroe girl was running a shop on old Ward property. Cassidy frowned. My dad bought this land in '85. Built this garage himself. Roger gave a knowing smile. Then your father never told you the truth. He walked over to the back wall, the one Cassidy had torn open, and placed his palm on the seam like he'd touched it 1,000 times before. This land belonged to Ward. After the project was shelved, they ordered the test crafts scrapped. He couldn't do it. He had one prototype flown here in pieces, hid it under a false business one they never checked. Cassidy stood frozen. My dad helped him hide it? Roger turned, eyes soft. Your father was a machinist on the project before he left the military. Quiet guy, brilliant. He and Ward were close. I think they shared the same belief, that some things were worth protecting, even when no one else believed in them. Cassidy's throat tightened. Everything she thought she knew about the shop, about her dad, was shifting. She gestured toward the hidden door. I found the plane. I found his journal, the tags, everything. Roger nodded solemnly. Then, you were meant to. He walked over to her workbench and picked up the tags gently, like they were sacred. Elias always said this bird would fly again, not in the sky, but in the hearts of people who remembered what it stood for. Cassidy looked at the jet through the open doorway. Maybe it wouldn't fly in the air again, but it could rise all the same. The next morning, Cassidy met Roger at sunrise. He was already waiting outside the shop, coffee in hand, standing like a man who had slept with ghosts for decades and finally decided to face them. She opened the door without a word and led him straight to the plane. For a long time, he just stood there, hands behind his back, eyes scanning every bolt and seam, like he was seeing an old friend after a lifetime apart. She's held up better than I expected, he murmured. Cassidy didn't interrupt. She watched him walk slow circles around the fuselage, pausing every so often to run his fingers across old markings, whispering technical jargon under his breath. Finally, he turned to her. You know why your dad never told you, right? Cassidy shrugged, unsure how to answer. Because it wasn't just about the plane, Roger said. It was about protecting something pure, something untouched by politics or profit. This wasn't a prototype. It was a promise. He motioned for her to sit. She grabbed 2 folding chairs and set them beside the wing. Roger's voice softened as he told her the whole story. After Elias Ward left active duty, he'd been recruited into a clandestine engineering program, the kind that didn't officially exist. His specialty wasn't just flying, it was innovation. He and a small team designed an aircraft they believed could push the limits of manned flight without compromising safety or stability. They called it Orion, not after the stars, but after the hunter. She was fast, agile, engineered to outthink problems mid-air. But politics changed. Funding dried up. The program was shut down. Ward refused to let the aircraft be destroyed. So he dismantled it, shipped it piece by piece in freight-marked agricultural equipment, and stored it here on the land he trusted land, later sold quietly to Cassidy's father. Roger's voice trembled then. He couldn't finish it. Cancer hit him fast. And your dad? Well, he promised to keep it safe. Said if the time ever came, the right person would find it. Cassidy leaned forward. But why me? Why now? Roger smiled gently. Because you're not just his daughter. You're his echo. You've got his stubbornness, his mind, and his heart. And maybe more importantly, you're not trying to restore this to fly. You're trying to understand it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Ward left this with me. Said not to give it to anyone unless I truly believed they'd do more than rebuild. They'd carry the meaning. He placed it in her hands. It's yours now. Cassidy opened the book slowly. Inside were schematics, calibration notes, even paint codes, but also handwritten passages Elias's reflections on faith, failure, and flight. He wrote about how he hoped Orion would teach future generations about vision, not war. That maybe one day, someone would find her and realize not all machines are built for destruction. Some are built for memory. Cassidy closed the book with tears stinging her eyes. She suddenly understood. This wasn't just a buried aircraft. It was an inheritance, and she had been chosen to carry it forward. It was a Wednesday when she finally rolled out the old cherry picker and aimed it toward Orion's intake. The morning sun lit up the garage like a spotlight, casting golden streaks across the smooth fuselage. Cassidy stood in coveralls and gloves, hair tied back, a look of quiet determination on her face. This was the first real attempt to touch the heart of the machine, not just to observe or clean it, but to wake it. She had spent nights combing through both notebooks, her father's and Elias Ward's, comparing fuel line drawings, turbine schematics, and handwritten warnings scribbled in margins. Engines hate guessing, one line had said. They'll forgive rust, not disrespect. She respected every bolt, every weld. She wasn't just trying to start a machine. She was asking it permission. The main turbine assembly was corroded, but not beyond hope. Cassidy flushed the lines, replaced rubber seals, and cleaned gummed oil residue with a toothbrush and kerosene. It took her days to track down a starter motor that even remotely matched what Orion needed, and when she finally did, she had to machine the bracket herself. But that was the beauty of small garages. They had no rules, only workarounds. She rigged a fuel drip test with surgical precision and set up her father's old multimeter like it was a relic from the Apollo program. The first time she hit the ignition switch, nothing happened, just a click. The second time, the turbine spun a quarter turn before groaning to a stop. The third time, though, there was a cough, a pop, and a brief, shallow roar that startled a flock of crows from the trees outside. Cassidy jumped back, heart in her throat. It was working, or at least trying to. She didn't tell Roger right away. Instead, she grabbed her phone, propped it on a tripod, and filmed the next attempt. This time, she primed the lines longer, reset the circuit manually, and whispered, "Come on, old girl." The turbine spun again, and then caught. Not fully, not smoothly, but enough for the camera to pick up a low, ghostly hum. Cassidy let it run for 3 seconds before cutting the fuel line. When the engine stopped, she was shaking not out of fear, but from the thrill that comes when the past breathes again. She uploaded the clip later that night with a simple caption, "Didn't expect this to live again." No hashtags, no tags, just the truth. By morning, the video had 0 views. By noon, over 100, 0. And by the time she closed the shop at dusk, her inbox was flooded. Messages from old pilots, engineers, aviation geeks, conspiracy theorists, mechanics, journalists. They all wanted to know the same thing. What is this plane? Where did it come from? How did you find it? Cassidy stared at the screen, overwhelmed but grounded. She hadn't done it for attention, but now, attention had come anyway. The question was, what would she do with it? And more importantly, who would try to take it away? 2 mornings later, Cassidy opened her garage door to find 3 news vans idling on the gravel shoulder. One from the local station, one from Atlanta, and the third, marked with a glossy national network logo, had 2 crew members already unloading camera gear. Her heart sank. She'd seen the comments spiraling online, watched the view count skyrocket past 1 million overnight, but somehow she hadn't expected them to actually show up. The moment she stepped outside, microphones turned toward her. "Is it true you found a hidden Cold War aircraft in your garage? Is this part of a military cover-up? What does the Air Force have to say?" Cassidy froze for half a second before answering the only way she knew how, with calm, careful honesty. "I found a plane," she said. "And a story. I'm just trying to do right by both. That answer didn't stop the flood. If anything, it stirred the pot. The internet exploded. Aviation forums were ablaze with speculation. Reddit threads popped up dissecting every inch of the footage, zooming in on fuselage stamps and cockpit dials. Was it a prototype for stealth tech? A scrapped NASA program? Some even claimed it was alien. Cassidy ignored the wild ones and focused on her work. But then came the emails, one in particular, stamped with a .gov address, requesting a site visit. No signature. Just an appointment time and a vague mention of historical interest. Roger came by that evening and read it with a deep frown. They've finally seen it, he muttered, and they don't like what they can't control. Cassidy felt the pressure mount quickly. First it was the reporters, then a pair of men in plain suits who showed up 2 days early, flashing credentials but offering no business cards. They didn't try to seize anything, not yet, but they asked questions that didn't sit right. Has the aircraft been moved? Has anyone else had access? Are you in possession of any supplementary materials? She knew they meant the journals. She told them the plane hadn't moved and that she was working under private property laws. It was true, but it felt like a countdown had started. Then came the pushback from the community. Some praised her, called her a hometown hero, a restorer of forgotten glory. But others, the ones who had mocked her for years, now claimed she was exploiting a story that didn't belong to her, that she was riding coattails, that she didn't deserve the spotlight. Cassidy tried not to let it sink in, but some days it did. The weight of judgment pressed down on her harder than any wrench ever had. She wasn't chasing fame. She never wanted that, but she'd found something sacred. And now the world was clawing at it. Roger sat with her late one night in the shop, the two of them drinking bitter coffee in silence. You know they might try to take it, he said quietly. Cassidy nodded. Let them try. Her voice didn't shake. This was buried for a reason, but I'm not burying it again. And in that moment, something shifted. She wasn't just protecting a discovery anymore. She was defending a legacy. Cassidy knew the plane couldn't stay hidden forever, but that didn't mean it had to be taken. So she filed for historical designation, through the state, quietly, strategically. It wasn't easy. There were forms she barely understood, calls with officials who gave her the runaround, and multiple site inspections that felt more like interrogations than assessments. But she persisted. With Roger's help and a growing group of aviation enthusiasts backing her online, she built a case. This wasn't just a machine. It was an artifact of innovation, a piece of buried history that deserved preservation. In the meantime, she continued her restoration, not to fly Orion again, but to rebuild her into a static exhibit, a living classroom, a tribute. One morning, she rolled the fuselage into the open bay, where sunlight could reach it fully for the first time. She polished the canopy, painted over the corrosion with the exact shade from Elias's notes, hunter's gray with a matte finish. When she stepped back, it gleamed like a memory finally exhaled. That same week, a letter arrived. The state had approved her petition for historical protection. Orion was now registered as a Cold War-era engineering relic, and Cassidy was officially recognized as her custodian. It didn't stop the attention. Nothing could do that now, but it gave her leverage. The suits couldn't take the plane. Not legally, not anymore. They called once more, asked to discuss options. She told them the option was simple. She stays here. Then she hung up. With the designation in place, Cassidy launched something she hadn't dared imagine before. The Orion Legacy Project. A small, self-funded initiative to transform the back half of her garage into a hybrid museum and mechanical education space. It started with a few locals volunteering to help clean up the property. Then came a retired science teacher who offered to host field trips. And then a grant from a veterans group that had seen the story on national news and wanted to help preserve Elias Ward's dream. The plane was no longer a secret. It was a symbol. On opening day, they didn't have banners or confetti. Just a chalkboard sign out front, and a line of people stretching down the gravel drive, veterans in wheelchairs, kids in aviation camp t-shirts, mothers holding coffee and curiosity. Cassidy gave the first tour herself. She didn't dress up. No makeup. Just her coveralls and boots, sleeves rolled, grease under her fingernails. She told them the truth. About her dad, about Elias, about the wall that had hidden everything for so long. She showed them the journals, the tags, the flight plans, the engine. She watched faces light up, eyes widen, hearts soften, and for the first time, she realized what this had all been building toward. Not a plane in the sky, a story in the soul. She hadn't restored Orion to soar. She'd restored her to mean something, and maybe, just maybe, that meant she was finally ready to do the same with her own life. The sun was setting when Cassidy finally turned off the shop lights. Orion now sat proudly beneath a canvas awning at the back of the property, surrounded by signs explaining her history, ropes gently keeping kids from climbing too close, and fresh flowers someone had left, beneath the nose cone with a note that simply read, "Thank you for remembering." She walked the gravel path toward the old fuselage, her boots crunching quietly with each step. The air golden and warm. It didn't feel like a garage anymore. It felt like a place where something holy had happened. Not religious, maybe, but sacred in the way truth is sacred. She placed her hand on the cool metal, just below the canopy, and closed her eyes. For months she had fought to protect this, to give it meaning. And now, finally, it felt at peace. Later that week, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small velvet pouch containing a folded medal, the kind given out by classified programs that didn't officially exist. There was no note, no signature, just the medal and the silent understanding of what it meant. Cassidy placed it in a glass case beside the journal, next to the dog tags and the framed letter from the state. She didn't need more words. Some stories spoke loudest in silence. The garage changed after that, not in structure, but in spirit. More people came not for oil changes, but for the feeling. Veterans sat and told stories they hadn't spoken aloud in decades. High school girls asked questions about welding. One boy started volunteering every Saturday, sweeping the floor with a quiet reverence, like the space itself deserved respect. Cassidy kept her prices low and her standards high. She didn't raise her voice or chase headlines. She just showed up, grease on her hands, head held steady, fixing what she could. One afternoon, she found Roger in the bay, polishing the landing gear by hand. He looked up, smiled that soft, weathered smile, and said, "You gave her wings again, Cassidy." She looked at Orion and then back at him. "She gave them to me first." And it was true. Because this journey hadn't just restored an aircraft. It had restored something inside her that had long been buried. Confidence, purpose, pride. For years she had patched up other people's machines, quietly carrying her father's legacy without ever fully claiming it. But now, she stood not as a placeholder but as a builder, a protector, a voice. That night, Cassidy sat under the stars beside the plane, her coveralls stained and her heart full. She thought about Elias Ward, about her father, about all the people who had once been mocked, dismissed, underestimated, and now she understood. The real engine wasn't in the plane. It was in the people who kept showing up anyway, who kept dreaming despite the rust, who knew that some things were worth saving not because they could fly, but because they refused to be forgotten. And she was one of them now.